Hello, and welcome to Booked on Shalom World TV. I'm your host, Clare Hinshaw. Today we are speaking with His Grace, Eduard Habsburg, author of the Habsburg Way. Eduard Habsburg is Hungary's ambassador to the Holy See and the Sovereign Order of Malta. Also known as Archduke Eduard of Austria, he is a diplomat and social media personality. Eduard is the author of several books, including the children's book Dubby the Double-Headed Eagle, novels, and screenplays. Your Grace, welcome to Booked.
Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Well, it's great to have you with us, and I'd like to start off with just kind of some basics about your book. So you share 7 principles from the Habsburg family and the Habsburg Empire that you say are useful for us in turbulent times. So first off, I'd just like to know what prompted you to write this book, why you thought it was necessary.
There was a very practical reason, and then there was more. Very practically, I've been asked by a friend close to Sophia Press whether I wanted to write a book about the Habsburg family. And I said, certainly not. There is enough good books about my family already. Don't need to do that. And then I began thinking about doing something different, not just a family history. So trying to figure out what are the things that make the Habsburgs tick. What are our central values, our central principles? And while I was writing this, and I was realizing that most of these points have slightly disappeared in our world today. And then I began saying, wow, perhaps that's something that would be helpful to present to people nowadays, to get it more into today's reality. And so from a family history book, it sort of became a kind of self-help book for our indeed very turbulent times.
Now, digging in a little more into the specific principles that you outline, one of them is simply be Catholic. And a more politically correct author might have said be religious or be moral. So why did you specify Catholicism?
You're absolutely right, Claire. The diplomat in me I would say be religious, because I know that many of my readers are not Catholic. Why did I say be Catholic? Because the Habsburg in me just has to say that, because we're Catholic. The Habsburgs were always Catholic. They were Catholic from 1270 to 1922, and we are still Catholic. There's about 300 or 400 of us all over the world, and nearly all of them are Catholic. So that's the reason why I said be Catholic. Also because I'm a Catholic. I believe in my Catholic faith, and I would wish for everybody to discover that faith. So there's no way around it. I have to say be Catholic.
Now, I found one of the most interesting elements of the book to be your discussion of the principle of subsidiarity, especially in the context of an empire. And you shared how important it was as a principle of the Habsburg Empire. So I would love if you could share a little bit about what that principle is and why it was so important.
The Habsburg Empire, from the beginning, from the 13th century on, was always a mixture of different languages, different races, different states that had to be kept together in a wise way by a very cautious and very just emperor. So the principles that the Habsburg tried to put into practice was subsidiarity, which is you let the lower level do what the lower level can do. The central organ, the capital of the empire will never interfere with the lower level. And this is a principle that not only the Catholic Church teaches and the Habsburg Empire practiced, but for instance, the United States are built on the principle of subsidiarity, that the single state has its power and that the federal or the central power isn't as strong, because the closer you are to the events, the better you can judge how to solve problems. That's subsidiarity.
Oh, I love that. That's so true. Thank you for explaining that. Now, something else that jumped out at me is rather unusual for our time was when you were talking about the courtly protocols. But you said, I want to get the quote right. You said, I believe that protocol itself is the very thing that keeps diplomacy alive in a time of great chaos. I would love if you could just explain a little more about what you mean by that.
Until I arrived as a diplomat here around the Vatican. And I realized protocol is an incredible gift. Protocol creates the space for partners to meet and to talk about things, but not just because of ritual or protocol makes sure that the weaker and the stronger are on the same level. Just one example, say an important country like the United States sends a new ambassador to the Holy See. You would believe that they would get precedent, that they would be treated differently. No, they will sit 15 rows behind the ambassador of tiny Hungary because the ambassador of tiny Hungary is here longer. So you have precedence because of your age. This is the great thing about protocol. It creates a space where you can meet evenly, talk to each other. It creates the rules to make communication possible. I have a high appreciation for this principle that was also important to the Habsburgs.
Oh, wow, that's so fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. Now, jumping ahead a bit, the very last principle that you outline is called die well. Could you just talk a little bit about what that means to die well? I think we have a very different understanding of that in our modern age than what you outline in the book.
This is a principle that, in my opinion, is one of the central principles of the Habsburgs, because they were Catholic and also because they were strongly aware that they would have to render accountability to God one day for how they ruled as emperors. They took their job very, very serious and they wanted to die well. Now, today, if you ask people how do they want to die, most of them would say in their sleep or totally surprised or without noticing. But this would be the definition of a terrible death. For instance, in the 16th century, Saint Christopher is not only the patron of cars, but was also the patron of a good death. And a good death was a death where I had the time to prepare for death, to go to confession, to ask for the graces, to prepare myself for the meeting with God. That's a good death. So the Habsburgs did everything in their lives already. So in the moment of their death, they would be ready to face God. And that is something absolutely wonderful, but something that people nowadays don't really appreciate or understand. That's why I wanted to put it into my book.
Well, Your Grace, I wish we could stay on for an hour. I'm so fascinated by all of this, but thank you so much for being with us. It's really been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you. That was very interesting, very good questions, and you got a story out of me that I've never told in an interview. I would say that was my mother reading to me and to my brother and then to my sister. Every evening my mother would sit in our room and she would read from a children's book that fired up our imagination. It fired also up our ability to formulate and to speak, and it awakened in me a great love for reading and later for writing. I began writing stories very, very early, and then of course for that reason I began reading to my children every evening. And I did so for the last 28 years of our marriage. And I can only strongly recommend this to anybody. Read to your children. I'm a rather impatient person. In this case, my research was twofold. I had to ask all sort of uncles and go through books to find out what are the principles of the Habsburgs, because I sort of had to find them. There was never a book on that one. And the other part was then reading lots of old dusty books from my parents' bookshelf, where they had lots of books about the Habsburgs, and filling in the chapters and finding good examples for each of the chapters. So it wasn't really hard work, and it was lots of fun. And I learned so much about my family. Really, I would say I knew half or a third before I began this work. I'm very thankful for that. I think the Catholic books that motivate me most are biographies of saints. I've got several saints that I love very much. One of them, of course, is Thomas More. I can read this fantastic biography that I think is called The Eye of the Storm, and it came out in Ignatius Press 2 years ago, I think. Absolutely fantastic, motivating. It shows you that one man or one woman can make a total difference if they live their faith like he did. So yes, biographies is definitely my answer. I think reading a story is magic. Imagine what you're doing. You're opening something made of paper with little black things in it, and your eyes focus on it, and you begin to read the lines, and while you read the lines, in your head an entire universe appears. And if the author writes well and creates fascinating characters and creates a good story, you will lose yourself in that. I have to say that reading a story is probably the thing that relaxes me most in the world, totally yanks me out of my work. And I love short stories. I love short stories. It's magic. So yes, reading and writing is absolute magic. I would say when I wrote novels, I wrote a few novels, and the first novel I wrote, I created a set of characters. It's a sort of romantic story between three people where you don't know how it's going to end. And I remember that this was one of the most intense periods of my life, living with these fictitious characters. And when I wrote the last line of the book and I closed my computer, I was in tears because I realized I would never be that close to these characters again as I was while I wrote them. And that's true. You read the book, it's not the same. While you write them, while you create them, you're so close to them. So that was a very surprising experience. I'm going to read you something that explains a bit how it is to grow up as a Habsburg nowadays, because that's a question I get very often. People asking me from such an old family, with all these traditions, how is it to grow up today? And so I'm going to read a passage from the beginning of the book to you now. Growing up a Habsburg. A lot of people seem to like the Habsburgs. At least that's the impression I get when I speak and write about my family. Occasionally, when I say something perceived as too conservative, like when I praise the Hungarian freedom fighters of 1956 on Twitter, I am bombarded with a storm of inbred marry your cousin Habsburg jaw jokes. Indeed, when I wrote sympathetic tweet that day that Queen Elizabeth died, I was called an inbred moron. But this usually settles down and the positive reaction to my family's history returns. I know that I move in a very friendly bubble of well-meaning folk. Nevertheless, I have the feeling that they are expressing more than just nostalgia for the good old days. The Habsburgs can indeed be seen as a model of a large, successful family, blessed with many marriages and lots of children. Historically, the family experienced few assassinations and made no great conquests through war, killing, or cruel intrigues. But more than this, in a time where every Christian value is being increasingly driven out of public life and politics, the Habsburgs stand for timeless things like family, faith, peaceful cohabitation of nations and languages, and peaceful coexistence of diverse races and cultures. Even if you're born a Habsburg, however, you still must become one. Today, young Habsburgs often first discover who they really are in school. The fact is, from 1273 until almost the present day, members of the Habsburg family were intimately involved in nearly every decade of European history. Not infrequently, a history teacher will lift his eyes and end a sentence saying, "But this is surely something that Mr. Habsburg can tell us more about." Alas, Mr. Habsburg, who is usually blushing in the last row, typically knows little or nothing more about it.
My name is Gina Mainello Sweeney, and I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to talk about the incredible book, The Habsburg Way. The Habsburg Way is the perfect antidote to this educational crisis. You'll meet fascinating characters and learn how they grapple with difficult circumstances, like Blessed Karl and Venerable Magdalena, who chose a path of heroic virtue. You may want to learn more about a given member of the Habsburg family, like seeking out the sequel to a favorite novel, a true goal of any educator for his students. As for me, I don't think it is possible to love the desperately romantic Maximilian I and Mary of Burgundy any more than I do. Their letters, the quest to rescue her, it all drew me in like a storybook. There was a profound understanding between the two, and that always points back to God. As for Maximilian, he's not only the last knight, but a writer of stories himself, which I need to find. Archduke Edward's writing is filled with personality and includes fascinating first-person accounts. It's extraordinary to hear from a narrator who lives the path known as the Habsburg Way. Yet, there's a quality to this book that goes far beyond knowledge. St. John Paul II once said, "Become who you are." A simple, somewhat enigmatic, yet deeply profound statement. I've always been drawn to it, and perhaps that's why I also found meaning in the Habsburg Way. Many today embrace artificial lights instead of true light. Pursue happiness without true joy. Archduke Edward calls it an empty aimlessness that torments so many and characterizes so much of modern life. Each rule in this book is unique, yet each contains light. There's an emphasis on honor and justice, the importance of family, growing in your faith, treating others fairly, and finding inner strength because of it. There are also seemingly simple moments that bring the greatest meaning. One of my favorite stories, whether legend or fact, was of the first Habsburg ruler, Rudolf I, who gave a priest his horse to cross the river, the Blessed Sacrament. What humility. And that's just it. Deep truths pervade the book that transcend common reality by seeking something greater. In a jaded world that often chooses chaos when what we truly need is to seek beauty, this is noteworthy. Due to these important universal themes, I highly recommend this book to all of Shalom World's viewers worldwide. And so, to return to that JP2 quote, if you read this book, you may just be inspired to become who you are as you carry your cross, recall your past, immerse yourself in the present, and set out on your own version of the Habsburg Way.
Thank you for joining us for Booked on Shalom World TV. Come back next week for another episode. Until then, happy reading.
My life is a miracle. Every child has a story of God's love to share. Shalom World, tune into God's love story.